One day a guy interrupts Jesus' teaching to try to get Jesus to settle a family dispute. "Rabbi," the guy says, "tell my brother to split the inheritance with me." Not, "Hey, Dad just died and I'd like you to remember me and my family in your thoughts and prayers as we deal with our grief." Not, "My brother and I are at each other's throats about stupid stuff that doesn't matter, and it's just that we're both hurting so bad and we don't know what to do with all these feelings, so it all just comes out sideways." Not even, "I could never get over the feeling that Dad favored my big brother more than the rest of us, and I'm both sad and angry at the same time. What do I do?" No, the guy's like, "I see you healing the lame and giving sight to the blind, which is great and all if you're lame or blind. But how about doing something about the inheritance laws, which give my older brother more of the family wealth than me, just because of an accident of birth? I mean, sure, I'm loaded now, but that's not the point. He's really loaded, and that's not fair. And while you're at it, can you also do something about the inheritance tax and capital gains?" The guy comes to him with rich people problems. "My brother can afford a Lamborghini and I have to settle for this stupid BMW. And Jesus says to him, "Dude, really? I came here to deal with some real issues, real suffering, real injustice. And you want me to waste my time on problems that aren't really problems?" And then he told a parable, because that's what Jesus did. He was a storyteller. When some people want to learn about the world, they head to the nonfiction section of the library. But when Jesus wanted to tell us the real truth about the world, he pointed us to the fiction section. Think about that the next time you're tempted to define fiction as a story that's not true. So, here's the fictional story Jesus told, which never happened, but is true nonetheless. A rich man had a farm. Now, Jesus didn't say a rich farmer. For the most part, you don't get rich being a farmer unless you're a corporation. But corporations aren't farmers and they aren't people. They're composed of people, but they themselves aren't people. My grandfather was a farmer, and he definitely wasn't rich. He lived in the same house he was born in, the one built by my great-grandfather, who was also a farmer, as was his father, my great-great-grandfather. None of them were rich, not even close. My dad and his brothers and sisters, they did all right. Every one of them made more money and accumulated more wealth than granddaddy or great-granddaddy or great-great-granddaddy. But none of them were farmers. They had to move away from the farm and from farming to gain wealth. You don't get rich being a farmer. In Jesus' day, you got rich by getting more land. And you got more land by raising more crops than you needed to live on so that you could then sell the extra to accumulate a little extra cash. And if you saved enough cash, then eventually you could buy a little more land, which you could then use to grow more crops, which would give you more to sell so that you could maybe buy a little more land. And eventually, maybe by the time you were old, you might have enough land to be called rich. But most people didn't live long enough to get rich that way. For one thing, real estate wasn't a commodity. People didn't sell their land. It was your only real asset, the only real way to feed your family. I mean, maybe if you lived by the sea and could fish pretty well, but go inland, you held on to your land at all cost, and you only sold it if there was no other way. Which brings me to the real way that people got rich in those days. Legal rich, I mean. There's all kinds of ways to get rich if you can assemble a gang or even better, an army, and then go out killing and conquering. But short of that, there was another way to get land. See, If you happen to have fertile land that generally, on average, received just the right amount of rain, not too much and not too little, well, you could generally count on having a pretty productive harvest, enough that you could eat some of the grain, support some of the livestock that you had with some of the grain, and you could save some of the grain to plant in the spring, and then you'd have some left over to sell at the market for cash or just store up. But it's what you do with the cash or the excess grain. You can save it in hopes of one day some land near or adjacent to yours would come up for sale, or you could loan some of that cash or seed to one of your neighbors whose land was maybe a little rockier and harder to till than yours, or was on the lee side of a mountain or hill that got less rain than yours, or who maybe got hurt the previous winter and come spring couldn't plow as many acres as usual. You could loan it to anybody who, for whatever reason, had suffered a bad harvest or two, and even after rationing food to him and his family, didn't have quite as much grain left over for planting the following spring. So you'd give him some grain for planting, with the promise, agreed to in the presence of the elders there in the town gate, that at the next harvest, you'd get the first 100 or so bushels of his harvest. Of course, his land was still rocky or still on the lee side of the mountain, so the next year he might come up short on the harvest, and so now he owes you the 100 bushels, and he can't pay you. So instead of you taking the first 100 bushels, you actually loan him some more grain, with the promise that at the next harvest, he'll give you, say, another 150 bushels on top of the 100 that he already owes you, 250 bushels all told. But because his land is still rocky or still on the lee side of the hill, pretty soon 250 bushels turns into 375 bushels, turns into 562 bushels, turns into 1,687 bushels, and soon enough, he owes you more bushels than his land is capable of producing. And he and his family are starving, and you can't have that, and the land was collateral for the loan anyway, so you take that sorry land off his hands, and then you hire him to farm it for you. And you'll pay him a decent wage so that he and his family can have enough to eat and maybe get some new clothes every once in a while. Well, I mean, not new clothes, mind you, but some used clothes that some rich person is tired of wearing and just, tosses away for nothing, and well, man, look, they hardly have any wear on them. Look, this one's still got its price tag still on. And if you have enough neighbors living on enough rocky soil or soil with no depth of topsoil or on the lee side of some mountain, why, a man with good soil and just enough rain, not too much and not too little, why that man can acquire a lot of land, way more than he could ever farm for himself. But that's the genius. He doesn't have to farm it himself, because now he's got all these former landowners sharecropping his land. They do all the work, he gets all the profits, and he doesn't even have to farm his own land anymore. He doesn't have to work it, because now he's got people to work the land for himself. So now he's a rich man, but he's no longer a farmer. He doesn't have to work if he doesn't want to, because, he's got like this corporate farm. So maybe a corporation really is a person, one really wealthy persons. So one of these really rich guys, Jesus said this guy's land, all his land, produced abundantly, so much so that the barn said he had couldn't hold it all. Now, this guy's got a problem. He's got too much. Well, no, that's not a problem. The problem isn't that he's got too much. You can never have too much. The problem is he has too little barns. I mean, he might have had more than 2 barns, but however many barns he had, they were all too little. And so you know what he did? He built more barns, right? Wrong! He didn't build more barns. He tore down the barns that were too little and in their place built even bigger barns. He tore down his perfectly good barns, barns that most farmers would have loved to have. He tore down these perfectly good but perfectly small barns. Well, I mean, they really weren't small barns. They were bigger than most of the barns around, but they weren't big enough. They weren't small barns, but they were too small barns. So he tore down the barns that were large but were too small, and he built even larger barns, huge barns, gargantuan barns, barns that were the talk of the town, barns that made it on the cover of Building Bigger Barns magazine. And when the bigger barns were built, he put all his extra grain, all the grain he didn't need to feed and clothe himself and his family and all his animals, his many heads of cattle as far as the eye can see, because he had a lot of land. He put all this grain, all this excess grain, all this excess, he put it in the bigger barns that he had built. And he sat down on the front porch with his wife and his kids and his grandkids, and he poured himself a glass of his finest port, and he said, "Life is good. This is the good life." But Jesus says that God says, "You fool." Ouch! Now understand, the translators of the New Testament were all good Christian men, learned men, polite men of grace and culture. So they all translate this Greek word, aphron, as fool, which is admittedly harsh, but it's not really harsh enough. But Jesus wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew, and not a good one at that, not according to the Jews who were good. And so what Jesus said that God actually said was more like, "You big dummy, you idiot, you imbecile, you Dallas Cowboy fan." Okay, that was maybe a little over the top, but you get the picture. "You idiot. This very night, your soul is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Dang, God is like really ticked off. I mean, he goes and kills this guy just to make a point. The guy he builds bigger barns, and he's all set to enjoy retirement. Although I'm not sure what would be any different in his life before retirement and after, since everyone else but him was doing any work. But anyway, he's all set for retirement, and while he's asleep, he has a heart attack or a brain aneurysm or a stroke, or God just zaps him right there in his Tempur-Pedic bed. And the guy must not have had any sons, because that would be the answer to the question, "And the things you prepared, whose will they be?" So I guess they had to come and auction everything off to the highest bidders. That's a rather harsh picture of God, isn't it? And while it certainly gets the point across, and we've certainly heard stories of people who retired and then died pretty soon after that and didn't get to enjoy their retirement, but we hear about those stories because they're the exception, not the rule. Most rich people who build bigger barns wake up morning after morning in fine health, or maybe just okay health, because some rich people like to eat KFC all the time. But a lot of other rich people stay quite healthy because they can afford chefs who prepare them healthy foods full of fresh produce, because it's always summer somewhere and they can get the fresh produce. And they have personal trainers who design custom workouts for them, and so they feel as fabulous as they look. So what's the deal here? Okay, so this is where I'm going to get a little English major nerdy with you. We got to talk some grammar, and not so much English grammar, but Greek grammar. Every translation of verse 12 uses the passive voice in the third person singular, "is being demanded." You remember the passive voice, right? Active voice is when the subject of the verb is doing the action, while in the passive voice is when the subject is being acted upon. The subject is passive and some other person or agency is doing the action on them. So in this case, your life is being demanded by someone else, and presumably that someone else is God, because he's the one who does things like cause heart attacks and brain aneurysms and strokes, right? And third person singular, because God is the third person and he's singular. Greek grammar doesn't deal with Trinitarian issues. God is one and he always speaks in the singular. But in fact, the Greek verb here is not in the passive voice, and it's not in the third person singular. It's actually a present active indicative third person plural, which ought to be translated, "This very night they demand your soul." Okay, so some of you may be thinking, well, how are we supposed to know that? We can't check you. We don't know Greek. You could just be making all this up. In fact, you yourself said to all the English translations of the Bible use the third passive indicative third person singular form. Your life is being demanded of you. So why shouldn't we trust their knowledge of Greek more than yours? Besides, isn't your PhD in Old Testament anyway? Now, I know at least one of you is saying something like this because my wife says it to me all the time. Pam hates losing arguments, especially arguments about the Bible, especially when I pull out the Greek or Hebrew card on her. Ask my Sunday school class. They'll tell you they've heard her say stuff like this all the time. So check it out. Here is my Bible computer program. I'm on the Greek text, and watch what happens when I hover the cursor over the Greek verb. Boom! What's it say? Let's zoom in a little bit. Aparateo, to ask for, demand. Verb indicative present, active, third person, plural. So, this very night, they demand your life, or they demand your soul. So that begs the question, who are the they who are doing the demanding? In grammatical terms, what's the plural antecedent? Well, ante means before, so let's back up one verse and see if there's anything plural in verse 19 that might be doing the demanding. So verse 19 says, "And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Well, there's the plural, ample goods. So could it be that Jesus is saying, that God is saying, you idiot, you built bigger barns to hold your ample goods, and now they are demanding your soul? Well, okay, that kind of lets God off the hook for killing the guy, but still, it's clear that the guy dies because of his greed, and it's not his goods which are able to kill him, so it's got to be God, right? But see, you're still assuming that the guy dies. So, everyone assumes that this guy dies, that God takes this greedy guy's life, which is why all the translators changed the Greek verbal form, because the way it's written doesn't make any sense, and a translator's job is to make sense of the original language. And in their defense, it certainly sounds like that's what happens, especially when you come to the second phrase, "and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" I mean, if the dude is still alive, there's no question who owns all his stuff, right? Or is there a question? Okay, so more Greek grammar nerdiness. Look right here at this word. It's the Greek word "estai," which comes from "imi," to be, which in any language is one of the most important words. In languages like English, we use to be to form our tenses. I am walking, I was walking, I will be walking. All right, so this word means to be. When I hover over it, we see that it's a future indicative third person plural in the middle voice. Now, you've heard of the active voice and the passive voice, but what is the middle voice? English doesn't really have a middle voice. It uses the active voice to express the idea of the middle, which is a verb in which the subject is also the object, as in John hit himself. John is very clumsy. We actually call this reflexive because the subject is doing something to itself. John is the one doing the hitting, the active voice, but he's also the one receiving the hit, which would normally be expressed in the passive voice. John was hit by himself. John just really needs to put the hammer down and walk away. In Greek, the middle voice is that in which the verb expresses both subject and object, as in a reflexive, or in which both subject and object are either indeterminate or ambiguous. And that's how it's being used here. Here it's stating possession. Who does it belong to? But it can also be put like this. Does it belong to who, subject, or to whom, object? Or more to the point, who belongs to whom? In other words, does the rich man own all his ample goods, or do they own him? Do they belong to him, or does he belong to them? One of the most interesting characters in modern fiction is a character in the novels of Lee Child named Reacher. His name is Jack Reacher, but ever since he was a child, he's always just known as Reacher, which is just one of the ways that the movie Jack Reacher, starring Tom Cruise, gets it wrong. The main thing that it gets wrong being that Tom Cruise plays Reacher. See, in the books, Reacher is 6'5" and 250 pounds of muscle, and isn't at all a pretty boy. Tom Cruise is 5'7" and 150 pounds of muscle and looks like, well, Tom Cruise. Anyway, the thing about Reacher is that he only owns the clothes on his back and a toothbrush in his pocket. He doesn't own a car. He either takes a bus or he hitchhikes, which is safe for him to do because he's 6'5" and 250 pounds of muscle. But when his clothes get too dirty or whatever, he just buys new clothes and he goes into the dressing room and he changes into them and then he throws the old clothes away. And that way he doesn't have to own a washer or a dryer, which would need a house to put them in, which would mean a lawn to mow and rooms to clean and taxes to pay and walls to paint and roofs to replace and on and on and on. And Reacher doesn't want to belong to things. So in a sense, he's free. He's freer than most of us. And when he encounters someone who needs his help, which happens in every novel, he's also free to help because he's not too busy with lawns to mow and clothes to fold and rooms to clean and property to protect. Of course, that's all fiction, and we all know that fiction isn't true. But this rich man with his ample goods, he needs more than just bigger barns because there are people out there who want what he has and are willing to take it. Maybe even have to take it because they can't afford to buy it, but they need it because they have families to feed and fields to plant. And, if they weren't so lazy and would just work hard, they wouldn't be in that position, but they lack the moral character to work hard and the moral character not to be thieves and rapists and murderers. So the rich guy, he has to buy locks for the big barns and a security system for his big barns and a fence around his property to keep the thieves and rapists and murderers out, except a mere fence won't keep out thieves and rapists and murderers. What he needs is a wall. Yeah, he needs a wall to keep them out, a great big wall made out of brick and concrete with razor wire at the top and a big metal gate at the entrance. And not long after he builds his bigger barns and huge wall with the big metal gate, some raggedy vagabond shows up, and this guy is disgusting. He's got sores all over his body, and the stray dogs, they come up and lick his sores, and it's really gross, this disgusting fellow. And when the rich man leaves his house, the guy begs for bread. And when the rich man comes home that evening, the guy is still there. And again, he asks him for bread, for just a little bread. And one time he even asks him for the breadcrumbs that fall on the floor under the rich man's table. How disgusting is that? And you can't enable behavior like that. I mean, if he gives him bread for free, well, the guy will never get a job, and he'll never be self-sufficient, and he'll never take personal responsibility for his own life. And besides that, if he gives him bread, word will get out that he's got free bread to give away, and other disgusting, dog-licking beggars will show up wanting free bread. And pretty soon other people will figure, well, why buy bread when I can go there and get it for free? And that'll drive the price of bread down, and the bread makers will eventually go out of business, and then they'll show up at his gate asking for free bread as well. And I mean, the whole economic system will break down if he gives this one poor beggar some bread. So day after day, he ignores the beggar. Until one day, the beggar is silent. He's dead. He's gone to Abraham's bosom in paradise. I mean, maybe if he's lucky and God is gracious to sinners like him. And the rich man, well, he goes in and locks the gate behind him. And after checking to make sure that his bigger barns are all locked up, he goes inside for supper. And when supper is over, he goes upstairs to read a little before going to sleep. And while he's upstairs, downstairs, the maid is sweeping up the breadcrumbs that have fallen on the floor under the table. She sweeps them up into her dustpan, and then she empties the dustpan full of breadcrumbs into the trash can, which one of the field hands will take out and burn along with all the other trash. And there's always other trash, so the fire burns constantly and is never quenched. And the rich man sleeps a quiet sleep because he owns so much, and it only cost him his soul.